بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. This is just to clear this confusion regarding the messages for DHCP. So in the standard it mentions that there are certain cases where these messages are sent as unicast, as we said last time. But these are specific cases. If the client is capable of receiving unicast messages before the end of these messages, because logically before the end of these 4 messages the client was not assigned a specific IP yet, in which case it cannot actually receive any unicast messages. But there are certain cases where the client is actually capable of receiving unicast messages, in which case these messages will be sent as unicast. But these are, let's agree that these are out of the scope of the course. So in general, before the end of these 4 messages, this client was not assigned an IP, in which case all the 4 messages are broadcast. Okay, so all the 4 messages are broadcast to clear any confusion, which deems this protocol really risky in terms of security attacks. Because, as we said, all the protocols that have broadcast messages are subject to attacks, and here all the messages are mainly broadcast, in which case there is a possibility that you can really attack the network DHCP while these messages are being transmitted. So this should clear the confusion. So today's topic is about application layer protocols that are used for file sharing and file transfer. So this is this is a control connection. So FTP is used for file transfer. It's a client-server application layer protocol. And it uses 2 different types of connections. So we want to know the difference between the 2 types of connections, and we want to see if we want to connect to the server with the purpose of downloading n different files. How many connections will we have with the server in that case? Not necessarily simultaneously. It could be like sequential, it could be parallel, okay, at different times. But starting from the time when the client connects with the server to download the content of n different files, how many connections the client will establish with the server? That's what we want to answer in the second question here. Okay. So you want to answer it collectively, or or you want to leave some time to just debate with each other first before we can answer this question? I think it's better to do it this way. Okay. So once the client starts to connect to the server, the first thing it does is that it establishes this control connection. The control connection is a long-term connection. It lasts during the entire communication between the client and the server, and it's used to authenticate, to write commands, and control basically the server from the client side. When the client requests to download or to upload a file, a separate connection on port 20 will get established per each file. Okay. So if you want to transfer the content of n files, you need n different data connections. Okay, and these data connections are temporary connections. You start it before you download the file, and you end it after you finish downloading the file. Same goes to uploading a file. Okay, whether these n data connections can be established in parallel or sequential, this is not our issue here. That depends on the FTP server. Some FTP servers may actually allow the client to establish n different data connections simultaneously. And some you have to do it sequentially. You establish the connection, you download the file, you cut the connection, establish another connection, and so on. Okay? So the FTP is clear in that sense. I don't see a reason really for having two separate connections, but this is how FTP was standardized, and in order to comply with FTP, you need to have two separate connections on two separate ports. SMB, or server message block, was initially designed by IBM in the late 80s. IBM, they actually developed that protocol initially to facilitate the sharing of resources from one machine to another. Okay? In which case, the client needs to access the printer, and the printer is physically connected. Physically معناها connected using USB on the server side. Okay? So IBM has developed initially the protocol called SMB to facilitate the communication between the client and the server, so that the client can map any particular resource. In that case, it's not only a file. Any resource on the server, whether this resource is a file, is a directory structure, is a printer, is a fax, anything. So we call it a resource sharing protocol, not file transfer protocol. Okay? So the client in that case sees that resource as if it's physically on the client. So the client in that case controls how to access that resource, which is physically connected to the server. Okay? So it differs from FTP with the purpose. FTP is for file transfer. SMB is for resource sharing, or for mapping a resource from the server to the client. So this is what we actually use nowadays when we map a drive or map a directory structure from one machine to another, which is built in Windows operating systems, and it's also built in Unix and Linux and Apple OS and all the operating systems nowadays. So we use that protocol to map a directory structure on the client.
Does this have to do with the clouds and how they are?
Well, yes and no. It's part of, it could be used inside the cloud to map a directory structure of مثلا Dropbox to see it on the client as if it's physical on the client, whereas the directory structure physically is on the cloud. So in that sense, you can use, for mapping the directory, you can use a protocol like SMB. Okay? As part of this resource access, you can then transfer files back and forth between the client and the server, right? So that part is similar to FTP. The main difference here is that SMB uses one long-term connection, okay? And it uses that for control, for data transfer, for everything. So there's one TCP connection which is used for bidirectional communication between the client and the server. And it's a long-term connection. It lasts for the entire duration of the communication between the client and the server. Okay? So the main difference between FTP and SMB is that SMB is more generalized. It's more for resource sharing, or for mapping a resource on the client to access it as if it's a local resource, even though it's a remote resource. It's not a local resource. Okay? The other difference is that SMB uses one long-term connection as opposed to FTP, which uses two types of connections. SMB uses one long-term connection for exchanging messages. That's why it's called server message block. And these messages could contain control information or data information, in which case it may actually include some file contents as well. فهمنا الفرق؟ So that's the main difference between FTP and SMB. Any questions? So that's it for today. So today's lesson is short because this is the end of the chapter and it's the end of the course material. We're not going to cover chapter 11, as we said before.